as a speaker. Ed Pearson is currently on the board of directors of the Pasadena Civil War Roundtable, holds the office of Vice President, and serves as our trivia master at each meeting. We hope you've enjoyed his snippets of Civil War knowledge we may not be familiar with. Ed attended USC and graduated from USC Law School, and he has been an attorney since 1978, practicing in the field of estate and trust law. Ed has always been a student of history generally, U.S. history particularly, and Civil War history even more particularly. And when he pitched me this proposal last year, I knew it would be a winner and the subject matter that we have never covered. So I hope you will enjoy his presentation tonight from the Civil War to the White House. Ed, please.
Before I begin, I have to make sure that I acknowledge my daughter Cynthia Pearson, who has helped me greatly in putting together the PowerPoint presentation and editing my text and so forth. Appreciate that very much. 1865 to 1901, 36 years, 8 presidents, the Gilded Age. Tonight we're going to look at 8 men, 7 of whom were in some way instrumental in the conduct of the Civil War. It is that war whose events and whose meaning brings us together as a Civil War roundtable. How did these 8 presidents experience the Civil War? And how did that experience propel them into the presidency? We're going to start with a short list, or a simple list. We see these names, sometimes we'll see photographs of all these men, and we may have an immediate, approximate reaction or characterization. A fat cat, the epitome of corruption, mediocre men in the highest office. But is that fair? I think not. Before we fully start, I know that we can't treat all of them. It would just be impossible. It's going to be hard enough to get through 4. But we're going to look at the experience of to see what kinds of soldiers they were and how leadership was taken up by them arising from their war experience. We may find that the reaction we have based to that presidential photo that I mentioned a minute ago perhaps is a little on the inaccurate side. There is much more depth to all these men, and I, for one, feel that it would be a worthy goal to read complete biographies of them. But that's not for tonight. How do we deal with so many? Well, we can barely touch on some and then concentrate a little bit more on some others. So, one of the ones that we'll spend little time with is Grover Cleveland. His war experience was that he didn't have one. He paid a substitute so that he did not have to go into the army. We'll consider him briefly. We'll talk about him a little bit. 2 others, Andrew Johnson and Chester Arthur, were administrators, but they were given the rank of brigadier general. So they held a military rank. In the case of Chester Arthur, he was working with War Department. He was a quartermaster. Andrew Johnson was really a politician. He was the military governor of the state of Tennessee for 2 years of the war. And I put in my notes here, it's a little generous to give them the label of soldier as compared to some of the others that we're going to be talking about. And there's a very, very famous and very important general that we really won't spend too much time with because he's so enormous in the conduct of the war, and that's Ulysses Grant. I'm sure there are presentations on him that, would make all the others pale by comparison. So there's too much to deal with in certain instances, too little in certain others. I should have mentioned, when you get in, and forgive me to those fans of Grant that are out here, we're not going to talk too much about him today. One of the things that I think is, maybe gives some context to this is that 8 presidents out of 45 that had served, that's 18% of the presidents of the United States. They all had some Civil War connection. And obviously we can't get through 18% of the presidents in just this short time. We have 4 remaining future presidents who fought in the war. These were the citizen soldiers that were described so well last month by Gary Gallagher. They are Hayes, Garfield, Harrison, and McKinley. What do we remember about them? We may have some vague notion that they were part of a string of moderately successful but not outstanding presidents, and that 2 of the 4 were assassinated. We remember Garfield for the appalling medical treatment he received after he was shot. We remember McKinley for the Spanish-American War and the inclusion of Teddy Roosevelt on the ticket for his re-election in 1900. But there was much more to these men, and their Civil War service is a key to understanding them. So I hope tonight that I can say a few words about their lives before the war, a few more about the time after the war, before they became president, maybe about their presidency, and maybe even about their life after they were in office. But that has to be minimized because we want to talk about what they did during the Civil War. I would say that all of the rest of it is framing for the wartime. Here are some preliminaries that I think are interesting. All 4 of these men were born in Ohio, as was Ulysses Grant. We associate Grant with Illinois, we associate Harrison with Indiana, but they were born in Ohio. All 4 of the ones we're going to talk about were lawyers. Many of them were involved, in fact most of them were involved in very close elections, relatively speaking, including one that was hotly disputed in 1876, very much involving Florida, who would think, and then one where the president-elect lost the popular vote, but won the Electoral College. That was Benjamin Harrison. During the campaigns for much of the remainder of the 19th century after the Civil War, the Republican mantra was basically, Republicans won the war, Republicans saved the Union, Republicans freed the slaves. And so you are given a choice between Republican warriors and Democratic traitors. That was the approach of all of those campaigns. And it may have been that the boys in blue tipped the scale, or tipped those elections in often towards these war heroes. There were some 1.5 million Army vets in the North, which represents a formidable voting bloc. They governed in a gilded age of gross excess, rampant corruption, sweeping change and surging growth, brilliant inventions, and artistic and literary accomplishments. All 4 of these fighting presidents were present at the Grand Review that we heard so much about last month. Hayes, McKinley, and Harrison were still in the Army. They had not yet been discharged. Garfield had left the Army 2 years earlier, but he was, or a year and a half earlier, but he was in Congress at the time. And so I am going to assume, with no evidence to support it, that he was there in the grandstands. So I'm going to make some generalizations that I think are kind of applicable to all of them. They all displayed leadership in their own style. and I think they were differing styles. They were, they carried a public persona which traded on their military service. And they were all honorable men. So, I should look at my clock to make sure I'm keeping in some reasonable degree of timeliness. But I'm going to talk about these 8 presidents in the order that they served as president, and that begins with Andrew Johnson in 1865. I'm going to rush through 4 of them, and I'll treat the other 4, the fighting generals or the fighting presidents, in a little bit larger detail. I hope to share some trivia along the way, and if there's time, we'll have a trivia quiz at the end. First up is Andrew Johnson. As I mentioned, he was military governor of Tennessee from 1862 to 1864. He was a congressman and senator from Tennessee who remained loyal to the Union. And so the state went to the Confederacy, but there were enough Union men that it was considered wise to appoint a military governor, and that was Andrew Johnson. He was a Democrat. And in 1864, Lincoln brought Johnson onto his ticket. It was Lincoln and Johnson, and it was not a Republican ticket. It was styled as the National Union ticket. And I think it was very deliberate to bring a Southerner onto the ticket and a Democrat onto the ticket. After Lincoln's assassination, Johnson became the president, and it was his responsibility to supervise Reconstruction, and that is where he came crosswise against many in the Republican Party. Johnson's approach was one of leniency toward the South, and the radical Republicans in Congress wanted a much more punishment-oriented Reconstruction. There were lots of reasons, perhaps, but that was probably the biggest conflict between the radical Republicans in Congress, Johnson in the White House, that led to Johnson being the first president to be impeached. And he only survived, he was acquitted in the Senate by a vote of 35 to 19 for conviction. It takes 2/3 to convict in the Senate, 1 vote more to convict to make it 36 to 18 would have ousted him from office. After his presidency, he returned to Tennessee. He eventually ran for the Senate in 1874 and was elected to the Senate, claiming vindication as for all that had occurred and the fact that he was now in the Senate, but he died 5 months into his term. Next, we're going to go to Ulysses Grant. We have just the basics concerning Grant, and then a slide that you're going to see again, which talks about where Grant was or what was happening for Grant at the start of the Civil War. And you can see what's up there. It's way too much to try and consider what Grant represented in terms of his military service. He was probably the most popular man in America. And there was even talk in 1864, there were many that thought he should replace Lincoln as President of the United States. And he downplayed that. His time would come a few years later because he managed to retain his popularity through the years of Reconstruction, where he was very, very much involved in it. There's a slide here about some major events that occurred during his two terms as president. His administration was beset by scandal, although most feel that Grant had personal rectitude. And after Grant's presidency, having suffered financial losses, he needed to find a means of supporting his family. As he was suffering from throat cancer, he began, or he may have begun before that, but he was actively writing his memoirs and for publication by Mark Twain's publishing company. He succeeded in completing those memoirs just before he died and left behind a document which was very much a savior for his family economically, and is a marvelous work as well. Okay, we get Rutherford Hayes, the next in line. And again, we have a slide that tells about where he was at the start of the war. He had been beginning to get involved in politics in Ohio. He was 38 years old, and he was a successful lawyer. In the early days of the war, a regiment was formed, the 23rd Ohio Regiment. And it's interesting to note the leadership of that regiment at the start. The colonel was William Rosecrans. The lieutenant colonel was Stanley Matthews, a very good friend of Hayes, who would eventually be a justice on the Supreme Court. And the major for the regiment was Rutherford Hayes. It just so happens that early on, a private soldier joined the regiment, William McKinley, age 18. And we'll talk about him a little later in our talk here. Here's what McKinley said about Hayes after he saw him in a battle situation. His whole nature seemed to change in battle, from the sunny, agreeable, the kind, the generous, the gentleman he was, once the battle was on, intense and ferocious. Of himself, Hayes said, and by this time he was a brigadier general, "I was one of the good colonels in a great army." I think he felt that the position as colonel was sort of the most he could aspire to, and really was most effective at. We have a quick overview of his time in the Civil War, including a statement made about him by McKinley again. Well, I wouldn't say that. I would say it's important to note that Hayes and McKinley, being in the same regiment, 20 years apart in age, they developed what might almost be a father and son kind of relationship. And as we'll eventually see when we get to McKinley, McKinley followed the exact same path. Congressman, governor, president, 20 years apart. Hayes was said to be determined, courageous, impetuous. He fought in 12 battles and other smaller engagements. He was wounded 4 times. The first area where I'm going to talk briefly about is in the Kanawha Valley in what is now West Virginia. He had been promoted to lieutenant colonel. He would lead his troops to a small victory at Princeton and was wounded for the first time as part of that battle. In July of 1862, his brigade was ordered to join Pope's army in Virginia. And this was just barely before Second Bull Run. But the unit did not arrive, they did not participate in that battle. But you know what would happen soon after was Antietam, and we'll get to that in just a minute. When it came to his leadership style, he was asked, how do you lead men in your unit? Persuade and be generous and dignified. And according to McKinley, Hayes was ever looking after the care and well-being of the 1,000 young men of the 23rd. Because he was a lawyer, there were times when he was appointed as a judge advocate to try cases in a military court. He was not terribly impressed with West Pointers, which is a trait that he shared with James Garfield. Again, we'll talk about in a minute. There was an early assessment of what he was like. He had a flair for leadership, he was popular with the troops, and he was an aggressive commander. Hayes' own philosophy is expressed in this way: fighting battles is like courting the girls. Those who make most pretension and are the boldest usually win. So go ahead, give good hearty yells as you approach the enemy. Let the band play. There was one incident that occurred that sort of endeared him to his troops. There was an occasion when members of his unit had been using fence rails. This was in Maryland, part of the Union. They were using fence rails for firewood, essentially. And they were called on that by a general, Major General Marcus Reno. And Hayes stood up for his troops and basically said, they need to do this, they have been doing this, and it's important that they continue to do this. And that made him somewhat of a hero in the eyes of his troops. I meant to say, sort of before the war, that one of the things that he had been doing as a lawyer was sometimes handling fugitive slave cases as a lawyer in Ohio, including one where he was co-counsel with Salmon Chase, another big name of Civil War days. A second significant action in which Hayes was involved was at South Mountain, on the road to Antietam. There was the first beginnings of what would become the Antietam battle, and at South Mountain, one of the gaps that was to be attacked was called Fox's Gap. And as part of the 23rd, heading into that area, Hayes received a wound above his elbow, and it laid him down on the field. He tried to direct his troops from the field, and it simply wouldn't happen. He was removed from the battlefield and sent to recover in a town called Middletown, Maryland, which means that he missed the Battle of Antietam. He was not present. Another important battle situation was that of Cloyd's Mountain. Cloyd's Mountain is in southwest Virginia, and May the 9th of 1864, a not insignificant battle occurred there. Well, if you know early May of 1864, that was when the wilderness was happening and Spotsylvania was happening. And so Cloyd's Mountain has kind of been pushed to the side. People don't know it much. But it was then that Hayes was part of the army of George Crook. And at Cloyd's Mountain, there was a very intense and deadly battle. It's important to bring up the name of George Crook again. Later in 1864, Hayes and his wife had a new son. And the new son of this couple was named George Crook Hayes. He named his son after his commanding officer. Later in 1864, we're talking July through September, etc., the focus of the war, or a focus of the war, was the Shenandoah Valley. And it was there, again, that Hayes and the 23rd, or the brigade of which the 23rd was a part, because as time has gone on, Hayes is elevated to command of a brigade, of which the 23rd is a unit. Frequent battles around the city and town of Winchester. Some of the names of those are Kernstown, Berryville, Opequon Creek. Sometimes 3rd Winchester would be the way it would be styled. At one of these, it is credited that Hayes saved the command from annihilation. And we can't get really into too much of the specifics of what he was doing, but he certainly was there. His 3rd wound occurred in or around Kernstown. At Opequon Creek, Hayes is given what is referred to as his finest moment, where other units of the Union Army have been pushed aside, they're in retreat, and Hayes comes into the scene and saves the day, so to speak. And then finally, in the Shenandoah Valley, we have Cedar Creek. This is the action at which Sheridan makes his, famous ride and blows the Confederates out of the valley, or at least begins that process. At Cedar Creek, again, Hayes is involved, and at one point he's on his horse, and his horse is shot out from under him. And he is slightly wounded, we'll call that wound number 4, although it was not a serious one, but he was in the midst of a lot of rebel troops. And it was thought by his own soldiers who saw this happen from a slight distance, that he had died. In fact, there was a report made that he had. Unfortunately, it was intercepted before his wife could learn of it. Like any of these men, people were pushing him to be in Congress. And he would be nominated to serve in the House of Representatives. And he was asked, it would be good for your campaign if you were to take a furlough and go campaign back in Ohio. And this was his response. An officer fit for duty who at this crisis would abandon his post to electioneer for a seat in Congress ought to be scalped. You may feel perfectly sure I shall do no such thing. And of course, that's the kind of thing that gets you elected when you say that. So he would be elected in late 1864 for a term that would not begin until December of 1865. So he was able to continue in the Army through the rest of the war. He was part of the Grand Review. And after the war, he followed these steps towards the presidency. Service in Congress, governor of Ohio, and while he was governor, Ohio became one of the states to ratify the 15th Amendment. And if there are any Buckeyes out here, he was instrumental in the creation of the Ohio State University. He would be elected in 1876 in a very controversial election. I mentioned that Florida was part of the whole thing. The uncertainty about who had won the election carried into March of 1877, when the new administration would come in. And there is either speculation or even some degree of confidence that there was a compromise struck, a bargain struck, where some of the southern states whose electors were uncertain would agree to support Hayes, and Hayes would begin, not just begin, but take a huge step toward ending Reconstruction and removing federal troops from the South. I have the, if I can find it. Well, all I will say is that he was what you might consider almost an early progressive. He had some statement to the effect that Lincoln declared that this was to be a government of the people. But according to Hayes, it seems like what has occurred is that it is a government of the rich, by the rich, and for the rich. Anyhow, he was a terrific lawyer, had a few years after his service as president to be able to practice law once again. We're going to take on Garfield. We have a little statement of basic biographical facts. In terms of before the war, he was quite a bit into education. His father had died when he was age 2. He grew up in great poverty. But when war came, I think he was at this point 31 years old or 30 years old, maybe not quite. And we have a slide that tells what he was doing at the start of the war. He was a lawyer. He was a politician. He was in the state senate of the state of Ohio. And then we have a slide that shows kind of a quick summary of Garfield's service. I mentioned a minute ago about Hayes being elected in November 1864 to serve a term beginning not until late 1865. The same occurred with Garfield, except his election occurred in November of 1862. His term in Congress would not begin until December of 1863. So he signed up. He was made immediately colonel of a regiment, the 42nd Ohio Regiment, and began to serve, as did Hayes, and I meant to mention this, and Harrison, who we will talk about a little in a minute. They were all part of the Army of the Cumberland, of which Rosecrans was the general. And that will become important in connection with Garfield. His first big action, it was kind of an independent one, was in the Big Sandy Valley, which is in southeastern Kentucky. It was there that Garfield displayed some of the boldness and almost the recklessness that characterized his war time. Against a force that was numerically superior, he divided his forces and came at the enemy from 2 different directions, which led the enemy to believe that they were had fewer soldiers. It was perhaps foolish. It certainly was lucky. But the kind of combative and imaginative approach that Garfield took carried the day. This is approximately the Battle of Middle Creek in early 1862. This is what one of the soldiers said about Garfield. The picture of the brave Garfield, steady at the helm, making the terrible passage up the Big Sandy to feed his hungry boys, would one day appeal to voters. They all did trade on this war service to convince people that they were the right people to lead one politically. Garfield soon got involved in politics. It was then that when he took sick leave in August of 1862, that people began this drumbeat, you should become a congressman. And he did indeed run for Congress in 1862, again, not to serve until beginning in December of 1863. He was one of the judges in the court-martial of Fitz-John Porter regarding Porter's perceived bad performance at Second Bull Run. He had attitudes towards the military establishment that grew out of the Porter trial, including his uncertainty, I guess you would say, about the loyalty and the competence of West Point officers. Rosecrans picked Garfield, who's now 31 years old, to be his chief of staff. And so he leaves his regiment, becomes a chief of staff to Rosecrans. And there is a scene that is described where Rosecrans calls a council of war. He brings together his most important generals and leaders, many of whom are West Pointers. And to a man, with the exception of Garfield, they all cautioned against rash action. Garfield won the day with his argument that the army that Rosecrans commanded should really take significant action to drive General Bragg and the other Confederates out of Tennessee. And thus began the Tullahoma campaign, which would ultimately indeed succeed in driving Bragg most of the way out of Tennessee. There is it's way too much to talk about the Battle of Chickamauga, but my little knowledge of it is that a big gap appeared in the Union lines, and the rebel armies were able to exploit that gap. Garfield saw this happening, tried to get Rosecrans to do what's necessary to plug the gap, and felt like Rosecrans kind of froze and lost his confidence. And it is true that Rosecrans retreated into Chattanooga, and Garfield and a couple of others raced by horseback to join George Thomas, who would ultimately earn the title of the Rock of Chickamauga for standing firm against the rebel onslaught. This was romanticized, probably, certainly built up. There were poems written about Garfield's ride, where he joined up with George Thomas. Again, the kind of thing that will be used in campaigns still to come. That was really his last war service, because that occurred in September 1863. There were some fallout into October and so forth, but he was going to go into Congress starting in December of 1863. So his wartime was done. Perhaps some mistreatment politically of Rosecrans in the months following Chickamauga. But after the war, he spent beginning in the war, 1863, all the way up to 1880, he spent 17 years in Congress. For part of that time, he was the minority leader for the Republican House delegation. He was certainly counted among the radical Republicans during his time in office. When it came time for the Republicans to select a candidate in 1880, Garfield emerged as a compromise candidate. There were lots of internal disputes, warring factions within the Republican Party. Seems to me I heard something like that. And in this case, on the 36th ballot, Garfield emerged as this compromise candidate. And as part of that compromise, Chester Arthur would join the ticket. They were part of the so-called, the two factions were the stalwarts and the half-breeds. And I can't remember the who's who of all that. As part of the campaign, one of the things that is remembered is that Garfield made a wonderful speech in which he extolled the boys in blue and let the country know how important they had been to the war effort. And it's also significant to know that during the campaign, he would always refer to himself, and others would too, as General Garfield. He'd been out of the Army for 17 years, but he was still General Garfield. It happened that the candidate for the Democratic Party was also a former Civil War general, so he had to make sure that everybody knew it. Let's see, I thought there was a quote here. No. Now we'll go back to, again, a brief consideration of one of these generals, and that's Chester Arthur. Garfield was assassinated just 6 months into he was shot about 4 months into his term, lingered for about 2 months, and died 6 months into his term as president. And Chester Arthur, vice president, then became president of the United States. One thing that I wanted to make note of is that Chester Arthur, another one of these lawyers, was very much involved in cases involving some of the kind of leading political issues of the day. In 1852, a Virginia couple came to New York City with 8 enslaved individuals. Arthur's firm took up the case on behalf of the slaves to test the fugitive slave law, and they won a victory. In 1854, Arthur defended an African-American woman who had been ejected from a New York City streetcar and helped to achieve the desegregation of those streetcars. So that's the kind of man that Arthur was. He was not a fighting general, but he was quartermaster general of the state of New York's militia. And he loved that title, and he was, to the end of his life, wanted to be referred to as General Arthur. But it was somewhat a political office. And when a Democrat came into power in New York in late 1862, Arthur's war service essentially ended. Someone else became quartermaster general. There was I don't know exactly what it is that Bright's disease is, and maybe it's not even called that anymore, but Arthur had Bright's disease when he was president and managed to hide the fact that he was ill. He did not live long after his presidency and died of that disease maybe a year or so after. But there is one time, I hope I can find it. Anyway, he was referred to as someone who had come into office completely distrusted by everyone, and who left office as someone widely respected by all those in the United States. Another one to spend just a couple quick minutes about is Grover Cleveland. He's the non-soldier of this group. He's a Democrat who interrupted the string of Republican administrations beginning in 1884 when he was elected. During the war, before the war and during the war, he had been a lawyer and a politician in the state of New York, including Assistant District Attorney for Erie County, New York. He had avoided war service by paying a substitute and was therefore labeled a slacker. He was mayor of Buffalo, governor of New York, and then in 1884 ran for president. This was the first election in which there was no candidate for president who had not been a Civil War soldier. The Republicans nominated someone for vice president, who we heard about a couple months ago, Black Jack Logan. He was the Republican candidate for vice president, but there was no presidential candidate who was a military veteran. In 1888, he would run again for presidency, but it was said that he seemed disinterested. Whereas he was up against Benjamin Harrison, our next subject. Benjamin Harrison was energetic. He gave 80 speeches in 16 weeks. He criticized votes made by Cleveland that turned down pensions for Civil War veterans. And Harrison, we'll see in just a minute, was the grandson of a president. He was the grandson of William Henry Harrison, elected in 1840. And he was further a descendant of another man named Benjamin Harrison, who had signed the Declaration of Independence. Cleveland and Harrison met again for the election of 1892, and Cleveland again was elected, being the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. So when we talk about presidential administrations, even though we have 45 men that have served, Joe Biden is the 46th president because we count Cleveland twice. He's both the 22nd and the 24th president of the United States. So let's go with moving on to Harrison. I mentioned his ancestry. He had much to live up to. He had what was described as a stiff, formal personality and was given the nickname of the human iceberg. Like the others, he was born in Ohio and educated in Ohio, but moved to Indianapolis to pursue his legal career and his start in politics. And we have a start of the war slide. It shows about what he was up to at that time. I think he was 29 or 27. What is that? He would be part of the creation of the 70th Indiana Regiment, and would be with that regiment, or perhaps maybe he was commander of a brigade, which included the 70th Indiana throughout the rest of the war. It seemed like Harrison and the 70th Indiana didn't get into much fighting. They always seemed to be in reserve. They were guarding railroads or doing things like that. And it really was then that I think some of his leadership skills came to the fore. He was quite a disciplinarian, but somehow he managed to keep together a unit that was itching to fight and wasn't allowed to. And he managed to keep their spirits up to the point that they would be ready when the time came. And the time did come as part of the campaign for Atlanta. Sherman's army was going to be taking on Atlanta, and there were battles galore, constant ones. They had missed out on all the biggies, like Missionary Ridge and so forth. They were ready to go when Sherman began his actions toward Atlanta. And his unit was put in the forefront. One of the many battles on the lead up to Atlanta was Resaca, May of 1864. And here there were skirmishes back and forth. There he is, Benjamin Harrison leading his troops. There was a time when the brigade, of which the 70th was a part, was going full out at the Confederate forces. And they overran a unit of artillery, of Confederate artillery. Where's that name? It matters not. But they managed to defeat the Maximilian somebody or another. Yeah. What's up there? Okay. And managed to secure those cannon. The cannon ended up kind of out in no man's land, and then later on in the subsequent period, the Union forces recovered those cannons. And it was during this time where, again, I think it was discipline that bore fruit for Harrison, that he began to achieve not just the respect, but even the affection of his troops. And they gave him the title of Little Ben. The Atlanta campaign kept going and going and going, battle after battle after battle. I don't think that the 70th Indiana was particularly involved. They were there, they were fighting, but it wasn't at the forefront. And after Atlanta was secured, as much as Harrison might have wanted to join the March to the Sea, he was first sent to Indiana, allegedly to do some recruiting for the 70th Indiana, but he felt that his real job there was to campaign for Republicans in connection with the 1864 election. And when he returned to the Army, he became part of that portion of the Army that was to secure Tennessee against now the army of John Bell Hood. And so even though they were in a reserve position during any of the battles in Tennessee, like Franklin, he was there at least. After the war, he returned to Indiana, became a U.S. Senator. He defeated Cleveland in 1888. And after his service and being defeated by Cleveland, he became an elder statesman, the best president since Lincoln, according to one. And lastly, we're going to talk about William McKinley. Again, I mentioned that he was only 18 years old when the war began, and so he was a private soldier, and he was joined up with the 23rd Ohio, the unit of which Hayes was commander, or would eventually become commander. And so many of the same battles that we talked about in connection with Hayes, he was there too. I seem to have a quote. McKinley was someone, that Hayes regarded as being one of the generals of the next war. I think to make that kind of impression on people at age 18 is pretty remarkable. And I have to back up, because there was another quote. Harrison, at some point, made a speech to the 70th Indiana, and the brigade commander remarked that that colonel of yours will be president of the United States. This is 1862. And sure enough, 26 years later, he is. But anyway, he was in the same fights as Hayes, except that he was president at Antietam. Remember that Hayes had been injured, had been taken away from the field at South Mountain. At this point, McKinley had been promoted to what is called commissary sergeant, and he was responsible for doing things like feeding the troops. At Antietam, his unit, the 23rd Ohio, was at or near the Burnside Bridge, and his troops had been fighting all day and had eaten nothing. And taking on his role of commissary sergeant, McKinley managed to put together a wagon load of things that could be taken to these troops and dashed past all kinds of enemy forces to deliver supplies to the soldiers of the 23rd Ohio. He became very, very famous for it. His promotions followed handily thereupon. He was only 22 when the war ended. And he went back to Ohio. He studied law. He became a lawyer. And he got into politics. And his ideal of a politician was Rutherford Hayes. And so what had Hayes done? Hayes had gone into Congress, Hayes had become governor, and Hayes had become president. And sure enough, McKinley followed that same pattern. Congressman, governor, and eventually president of the United States. Like I said, his presidency is known for the Spanish-American War, which occurred in 1898. He was re-elected in 1900 when he asked that Teddy Roosevelt become his vice president. And I'm going to take you back just one more time to May 1865, what we heard about last month from Gary Gallagher, the Grand Review. All of the armies of the Union, or many of the armies of the Union, marched in Washington, D.C. Among those marching were Hayes and Harrison and McKinley. As I said, I believe that Garfield was there too, because he was a major politician of the day. In April of 1865, after Lincoln's assassination, his body was taken to various cities in the United States, where there would be a procession in some of these cities. And in April of that year, it was in New York City, and who should be watching from a window was 6-year-old Teddy Roosevelt. So we have the President of the United States, the eventual President of the United States, marching in Washington, D.C., and the eventual Vice President of the United States observing Lincoln's funeral procession. And also it makes very clear that that represents the end of the days of the Civil War fighting presidents. So thanks very much. So, question? Yeah.
Why did Hayes only ran for only president for one term? And why didn't he run for a second term?
I think he had made that kind of vow as much to himself as to other politicians. I don't think it ever crossed his mind that he would go for a second term.
And a follow-up, why did McKinley dump his vice president?
Didn't get into that. I don't even know who the first vice president that he had was. You know, that seemed to be much more common than it has become in subsequent years. Yeah.
Cleveland sort of stands out. In fact, he was not. But do you think Cleveland would have been elected if he was running against the Civil War veteran?
In the first time, the 1884, you know, I think they did build up the Black Jack Logan aspect of that. I think Cleveland had an awful lot to overcome. The fact that he had not served in the war, there was this allegation of an illegitimate child, and nevertheless, he won. Who knows, you know, it's one of those impossible to say situations, but if they had nominated Harrison in '84, would he have been able to defeat Cleveland? He could not do it in '92, but he did in '88, so hard to know. Yeah?
You were mentioning that Ohio contributed more soldiers to the Civil War than any other state.
Per capita.
I'm wondering how that, if you would know how that happened.
I don't. You know, what I will say is that all of these generals that we've talked about, and McKinley, is that they rushed to join. And that seems to have been just a part of the DNA of people from Ohio. This is, you know, completely off the subject. I had a boss at one time who was a new lawyer, age 24, when Pearl Harbor hit. On December 8th, he was in San Diego signing up for the Navy. I think that was just the absolute instinctive reaction. And that seems to have been the case for Ohio. It may have been elsewhere, but I did see that Ohio proportionately sent more soldiers to the war than any other state.
I'm thinking that it wouldn't seem that they would be more populated than any of the other states that existed so much longer than Ohio.
Yeah, but I think it's as a percentage of population.
Oh, okay.
It wasn't the actual numbers, it was just the
Should have been
percentage you fought.
Should have been the volunteer state.
Yeah, and all of these were, volunteer outfits, or most of them. Yes, there were actual United States troops, but not that many. Yeah.
I'm sort of trying to answer this question a little, you have the Ohio River and across is Kentucky, so it very much, to me it was, you're on the forefront, right? If you're in Vermont, Vermont's not the forefront, but I would say that having been to Ohio, been to Kentucky and all that's it. The other thing about Ohio, we just think it was Ohio. I'm not going to say what I think of Ohio, but one thing about Ohio, they, at the time of the Civil War, they had more cities of over 100,000 people than any other state. Okay, so it was a very populous state. But again, I think the Ohio River, slavery, it was right on the forefront.
Yeah. Yeah.
Was there any other military college that was instrumental with these presidents?
Indiana too.
I don't know of any. West Point was I know the Confederacy had military colleges, but the only one I'm aware of is West Point. Yeah.
Okay.
Did these lawyers get any military training, or was it just, your gentleman, sir, here's your oak leaf?
It was much more that. I think at the time, somebody that had some stature, whether it was as a lawyer or politician, they were brought in with that rank of, in Hayes' case, he was brought in as a major, Garfield as a colonel. I don't think they had any military training. They just achieved that immediately. Now Rosecrans, he was a West Pointer, and he was the colonel of the 23rd. So maybe it was, they're going to grow under expert professional leadership. Who knows? Yeah.
I was going to say, wasn't West Point at that time more of an engineering school?
Well, but they certainly did churn out the generals of the Army. Yes, I think that is true, probably still is today, in some respects.
That's all they gave as a degree. You could only get an engineering degree in that period.
Yeah, but all of these Civil War people like Grant, who fought in the Mexican War, this was a West Point group, largely, at that point. Yeah.
On Hayes, you'd said there was a time he saved the command from annihilation, but you didn't have time to go into details, or you didn't have details?
I think that was as part of, I think it was with reference to Kernstown. It's part of the Shenandoah Valley, and frankly, I'm a little bit vague about just where these various actions took place and when, but I think it was in connection with the various battles at Winchester. Okay, we have a couple minutes still.
You mentioned the Cumberland Gap. How
Yeah.
instrumental was that in?
I don't recall saying that the army that we were talking about, Rosecrans' army, was the army of the Cumberland, meaning the river. So I don't know that it's the Cumberland Gap in Tennessee, Kentucky, wherever that is. Ready for a little quiz? Which of these 8 presidents is the only sitting member of the House of Representatives to be elected president? That's not just among this group, it's in all of U.S. history. Well, Garfield. He was in Congress in 1863 and elected president in 1880. Which of these men inducted into Phi Beta Kappa? We've got two. It's Garfield and Chester Arthur. Which president was arrested for speeding by a DC police officer in his horse-drawn carriage or his horse-drawn cart?
Wasn't that Grant?
It was Grant. Which president had the first phone installed in the White House and placed the first call to the Treasury Department, which had the only phone that he could call? That was Hayes. Which president published a proof of the Pythagorean theorem? It's Garfield. I don't know if you saw that up here, but Garfield, to me, he's the most fascinating of the group.
Thank you very much.
He was a Greek and Latin scholar, and it is said that for a parlor trick, he would ask his guests, ask me a question, and then he would answer that question by writing in Latin with his right hand, and then in Greek with his left hand. A pretty amazing guy. I mentioned this during the talk. Which president kept his serious illness a secret for many years of his presidency? And that was Arthur with Bright's disease, which I think is some liver complaint. I don't know exactly. Which president, when sheriff of Erie County, New York, executed 2 criminals? It's Cleveland. And this is for my son-in-law. Which president was a member of SAE, Sigma Alpha Epsilon? It was William McKinley. Again, I mentioned during the talk, which president named his son, born during the war, 1864, for his commander in the Army? That was Hayes. George Crook Hayes was the little boy born in 1864. I think I have 2 more. There are too many Garfield ones here. But I'm giving it away. Who was the last president to be born in a log cabin? It's Garfield. And I also think that this one was up there, but which president had a daughter after whom a candy bar was named? It's a candy bar that we still have today.
Baby Ruth.
Yeah, it's Baby Ruth Cleveland. I always thought that had something to do with Babe Ruth, the ball player. Nope, Baby Ruth Cleveland. So there you have it, folks. Next time, some more trivia.